I believe NOS4A2 is the perfect horror book. It's my personal favorite and a great book to read around the winter holidays or frankly any time of year. If you follow my channel, you know that I have put this book on the top of so many lists because I really do think it is the best, at least in my opinion, at least for my preferences. So this video, as I mentioned, is going to be spoiler free, meaning that if you have not read the book, you can safely continue. I'm only going to talk about plot points that are at the beginning of the book and more so talk about why I love the book in generalities. That won't give away too much of the actual experience and let you have that for yourself. And of course, if you have read this book, certainly I'm going to be hinting at things so that you know what I'm talking about and just allowing me to have the gush that I've been looking for. I can't believe I've never done this video before, but this is why I love NOS4A2 by Joe Hill, and this is why I think you will too. All that being said, let's get started. So first, let me talk briefly a quick spoiler-free synopsis for any of those that have somehow missed this book, are not aware of it from other videos on my channel. And so this is story. It's a piece of epic horror that follows a young girl named Vic, who as a child had this superpower, this ability to find lost things. She could go on her red bike, and with that she was able to connect and find things that were otherwise impossible to find through normal means. And then we follow her as an adult. Something happened as a child, she had an experience, and that is slowly revealed through the narrative, and then as an adult she has to face the evils that once she faced again. This book also introduces the villainous character of Charlie Manx, and he takes away children from their parents and brings them to a place called Christmas Land in his Rolls-Royce car, this very iconic vehicle. And of course the story goes from there as their two characters' plots and narratives intertwine into this epic adventure that gets big and punchy. This is a book with an incredible narrative drive. If you're someone who looks for an action-packed story, it is absolutely there. Despite the length, it is a page turner. Every time I read it, I fly through it because it is so bingeable. The way it is written has the last sentence of each chapter leading into the word that will start the next chapter, and so you just easily read and read and you will not want to stop. This is technically a piece of horror, but I also want to acknowledge that it is also considered a piece of dark fantasy, and certainly it blurs the line between those genres. So while you of course need to love horror, I'd also think that those of you that love fantasy to a degree or are okay with that blend of the genres are going to have the best experience with this. In terms of the horror elements, I find this book to be personally very creepy. I'll talk about a little bit why. A lot of it has to do with the fact that I connect very deeply with a lot of the themes that the author introduces, and the more I am immersed in a book, the more potential it has to scare me. And if you are looking for the scariest experience with this book and you are open to audiobooks, I know not everyone is and I respect that, it is one that I personally reread on audio myself because I love the voice of Kate Mulgrew, who's of course Captain Janeway from Voyager, and is just an incredible voice for the main characters as she has this gritty performance that really brings the book to life. If you're looking to see if the book's for you, if possible, try to just listen to the prologue or read the prologue, which in my mind is one of the creepiest scenes. It's one that sticks in my head. I can close my eyes and pretty much word for word go through that scene, and it bothers me every time I read it, even though I again know where the story is going. It's one that just almost gets creepier with reread, which is something that I think a lot of horror books struggle to do. Often the initial suspense is really where there is the buildup, but the actual reveals, the story itself just gets into my head and lives there, and it's just obviously a favorite for a reason, but really I'm hoping to convince a few of you more to read this one. Now, I think that there are 4 distinct reasons that I love this book, so I'm going to outline them. The first being the villain of the story, who I mentioned in that synopsis. Charlie Manx, in my opinion, is the best villain that I have read in fiction. Particularly, again, he evokes that sense of suspense and dread and fear that I am really looking for. I love the complexity of him. Certainly on the surface, you have this creepy old man, but when he reveals the reasons behind him taking away the children to Christmas Land, there's a lot of nuance to it, and I was surprised about the amount of empathy I felt, or perhaps sympathy, really feeling like his reasons, while horribly misguided, felt like they were coming from a genuine place and strangely gave me these mixed emotions. I think that that makes for the best villain, is one that is not simply evil for the sake of being evil, although you could argue that there is an element of that, but within their own psyche, they really do justify their own actions and really see themselves as being the righteous one, which again makes for a much more complex and nuanced story, which is always what I'm looking for. Now, certainly I've had other people mention in videos that his sidekick Bing is more the traditional bad guy who does the really tropey and despicable things. There's definitely that potential harm to other individuals, particularly the mothers, and I don't want to dismiss that. So there certainly are some disturbing elements to the story, but if you largely look at Charlie Manx, while I consider this story to be terrifying, to evoke so much emotion every time I read it, the core villain is not quite the black and white villain that you would see him to be. Instead, you get these really complex conversations that again make for a much more interesting story, and again a much more interesting villain. You get a bit of a backstory, a bit about his own life, his ex-wife, and so forth, and these little hints along the way that make the story so much more captivating, and I think really lean themselves again in my mind to rereading, because every time I reread it, I feel like I pick up more and more nuance of the history of Charlie Manx and why he might do what he does, and the things that are perhaps unspoken but are hinted at. And there's so much more that I pick up every time I read it, which again rewards me for coming back to this book year after year. Next, there is the setting, which I think is one of the great benefits of the story. I've said so many times on my channel that I love horror and dark fiction that intersects with the holidays and Christmas specifically, because of the fact that Christmas is supposed to be the jolliest time of the year, this happy, perfect time that is just emphasized through holiday movies and media and Christmas cards and all of these ideas, and often does not live up to our own hype and expectations. And so I love a dark fiction that really takes these things that are supposed to be perfect and turns them perhaps perverse, instead really flips them on their head, and instead provides a story that again is going to be more complicated and messy and dark, and perhaps is a good cathartic read for those of us that don't always have the perfect holiday experience and are looking to get some balance in our media at this point. And so that alone makes this book really compelling to me. While I've said in other videos, and arguably I'm saying right here, that this is the perfect book to read around Christmas, a lot of people going into this book don't realize that it's not really set around Christmas. Again, Charlie Manx takes the children to Christmas land, a time and a period of place that is always Christmas, and just allows them to have this euphoric experience where they get to live in the excitement of Christmas Day, even if the experience, of course, is very hollow. But I think that that again is a great commentary on how we treat the holidays and how they themselves can be very paper thin and really lacking the emotional depth and again, kind of the complexities of the whole situation by doing so. And so the story itself is again centered around other parts of the year, and by doing so, it actually almost makes the story more unsettling for me. There are moments where Vic is in the car and hearing Christmas jingles and having calls out to Christmas at a very different time of the year. A lot of this book is actually set in the summer, and so in the heat of the summer, you have these Christmas references, and it feels so out of place, so jarring, that again, I feel like it leads to that sense of unease as you read the story, because if the story had been set properly at Christmas, a lot of the mentions of jingle bells and things like that wouldn't be quite as creepy. And so I actually love it because I've definitely read this book at Christmas. I pretty much read it every single year at this time, but I also have read it during the summer, and in some ways it's almost just as enjoyable to read out of season because the book itself is out of season. And again, it doesn't lean too heavily into the holiday tropes, and instead takes them, plays around with them, but isn't following the cookie cutter setup that we see in so many themed thrillers and horror books that are clearly meant to be a quick cash grab for a popular author, and often again can be very hollow. Instead, this one is a full-blown, well-crafted novel that happens to have that Christmas setting, but is not something that Joe Hill did quickly. It's not something that's rushed or feels like an afterthought. Instead, it is this beautiful novel that happens to have a Christmas element to it, which again, in my mind, makes it just a huge notch above the rest of the fiction we're getting set in this time of year. And so if you're looking for something to read this Christmas, that's the reason I'm doing this video, is highly recommend pick up this book if you're at all interested, if you've already already read it, I encourage you to pick it up again because, like I said, I get more out of it each time I read it. And strangely, it has become my comfort Christmas read, even though, again, the book is not comforting at all, but it kind of has become that for me. Now, from there, I want to talk about how this book plays with the theme of childhood imagination versus the adult experience of life. And particularly, this book plays around with the fact that we as children have certain memories that are very much molded by our sense of imagination about how we perceive the world at the time, and often that can be starkly contrasted with the harsh realities of when we become adults. So this book does take place over multiple timelines. We see Vic as a child and her as an adult. And a lot of this book, without giving away too much, is really her trying to unpack the memories she has as a child that don't make sense, the things she remembers doing that she knows as an adult with her adult common sense are simply impossible. And of course, we as a reader, again, know this book leans into fantasy or potentially plays into that role. So there's the question of whether or not she truly was crazy or was there something more. And certainly lots of books play around, especially in horror and thrillers, play around with the question of the sanity of the protagonist, but I feel like this book does it in a more nuanced way that, again, as the book evolves, you will have that experience changed and molded, and it slowly pulls itself back and then gives you more reason to believe in magic, and then again gets more serious and so forth. And I really like how the book plays with that in the same way that you have the character herself trying to grapple with what happened. And so again, you have the challenge of, again, a child's experience trying to tell adults of what they're seeing, or in some ways is being old enough to know not to say things that are going to come across as impossible, and molding reality and almost wishing away the magic or just not acknowledging the fantastical things that are happening and rewriting history to make it more plausible. And there's kind of the different layers to it. You can interpret it different ways. So again, I'm really not spoiling anything. This is a conversation that happens throughout the whole book. And certainly by the end, you have to make an opinion about what is going on. And I think it's done very well. You will certainly draw your own conclusions, but I'm just not going to give them away here. And the last thing that I adore about this book, or at least the last thing I'm going to talk about here, is the representation of parenthood in this book. And this is very similar to my feelings in terms of The Changeling by Victor LaValle, another book I've done a full spoiler-free review, so definitely go check out that. But in this one, once again, you have parents at the center of the story. Specifically, you have generations of parents. So you have Vic at the beginning of the story as a child and getting to see how her own parents treat her, particularly her father, who calls her the brat, and the difficult relationship she is trying to navigate and the disappointment she has with her own parents. And you deal with her and follow her as she is going through these different pain points, really trying to find herself, and just, again, the disappointments of her parents along the way, both how they are disappointed in her and how she is disappointed in them. And then later in the story, she herself has a child, and again, this all in the synopsis and setup. And so with that, she then takes on the role of motherhood, having to figure out how she wants to be different than her own parents. And she is incredibly flawed as a mother. I always say that my favorite kind of stories that involve motherhood represent them as being misguided, flawed, human, and she is all of that. Quite frankly, she is quite disappointing at a lot of points in time. She does not do the right thing. She is not always perfect. And you get to see all of her mistakes, all of her baggage that holds her back from being the mother she wants to be. This book continues to be nuanced, and it never washes away the problems. Instead, it really looks at creating a story of growth and development for her as a woman and mother. And then if you're going to talk parenthood, we also have to talk about Lou, the father in this situation, the father of Vic's child. And he is one of my all-time favorite characters, all-time favorite fathers in fiction. And I know there is some conversation online about whether or not the writing of his character is fat-phobic, and I believe there's a lot of nuance to it. I think that the author starts out in a place that appears to be the usual fat-phobic messaging and does progress to something that does feel more nuanced, like a real person representing a person in a larger body without making them just one or two cliches. Certainly there's some parts that I think lean into tropes that we didn't need, but regardless, him as a person, he is just a wonderful human being. Again, he is flawed. He is not perfect. This is not a knight in shining armor, but instead a father who is trying to do his best, which I think is the most relatable. And so you have these two parents parents trying to do what is best within the lives of their child, but making mistakes along the way. And then of course you have the larger story, you have the villain who is at the center and certain things that progress. And within the story, there is the hero's journey. Once again, like The Changeling by Victor LaValle, you see characters having to push themselves to try to save the day. Of course, this is a horror story, so we know there are no guarantees, there are no safety nets, and so we can only watch, worry, and of course read along to see what is going to happen to these characters. But in terms of parenthood, I love the fact that it really deals with how we parent in reflection to our own parents, how we try to be different, and a lot of times how we as parents in general fail and really don't live up to our own expectations of who we want to be. And again, getting to really explore that in a very honest way. So while I love the parents that are introduced and described within the story, I also hate to see their journey because I want to yell at them. I want to tell them to do better. And again, the story is quite long. There's a lot of development that happens, but I think it's giving away too much to really talk more than that. But just know that if you're someone like me who loves a really honest representation of what it means to bring a child into the world and try to keep them safe and try to do right by them, and you're just hoping you're doing your best and that you hope is good enough, is a really important conversation, a big theme in this story that I think is so well done, and I just love how it comes together. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know if you haven't read NOS4A2, have I finally convinced you to do it? I know I talk about this book all the time, but I really think it has wide appeal. I think there's something for everyone, regardless of where you're coming from in life. If you just love great characters with a fast, exciting plot and some really creepy vibes, this book in my mind has it all, plus Christmas themes. And so I'd love to hear you down below as well. If you have read this book, I'd love for you to chime in. What do you love about the book? Do you agree, disagree with any of my points? Let's make sure to at least keep it spoiler free, or if you are going to talk spoilers, huge spoiler tags, add some spaces. I don't want to spoil anyone who is checking out this video and has not read this book yet. So if you are new to my channel, hopefully you stick around and subscribe. I do review and read a lot of horror and other dark things. If you want to hit that thumbs up, I appreciate it. Drop a comment, even if just an emoji, and hit that little notification bell so you never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. Talk to you again soon, and read NOS4A2. Okay, bye-bye.